Hey everybody, this is Mr. Baker. Hope you're doing well. This is Baker's Corner again. I wanted to actually take a few minutes to actually introduce to you all the Civil War. The Civil War, guys, is one of those more important events, and we're actually moving into part two of our lesson. We left off last time talking about strategies. I just want to bring your attention to a couple of things. If you think, guys, about strategies, what's one of the more important things to really keep in the back of our minds? The Union is going to have to do a lot more as far as like going into the Confederacy or the Southern states and actually trying to control a lot more geography, a lot more land. Whereas the Confederacy, guys, as you can see, is thinking, okay, we'll just do it defensively, right? For the most part. Now, there's a few exceptions to this, okay? But where we left off the last time was talking about this famous Anaconda Plan, right? So, guys, think about it like this. What are the Anaconda Plan details? Three really big things: blockades, controlling the Mississippi River, and if you remember, what was the capital of the Confederacy at the time that Virginia actually left the Union? They moved it to the city of Richmond, okay, which is only about 3 hours north of where I actually live now, right? So you can actually get on Highway 95, and it's going to take you through a good bit of Richmond. Okay, so they were thinking, okay, we can just basically do this. Now, as you can see, this is not going to be an easy task. It takes time. It's going to take a lot of troops. It's also going to take, unfortunately, guys, a lot of casualties. Okay, so it's going to be a very bloody war. All right, so keep in mind what we said last time: geography. You've got the east, the south, and the west. All right, easy way to kind of remember the Western campaign, guys. Remember, the more that you're moving closer to the Mississippi River beyond the eastern border states of the east and the south, the more that you're moving into the Western theater or campaign, right? Same basic thing. You can call it whatever you want to, but at the end of the day, guys, you're talking about geography of the conflict, okay? And so what happens? Well, by 1863, all right, let's take a look at what has transpired by the early part of 1863, about the summertime, is we have some key battles that are happening. Okay, so you've got Chancellorsville, which is where Stonewall Jackson lost his life, as you can see. You've got Antietam, which, as you can see, is a very small yet important piece, okay, of Maryland, which, keep in mind, is still a Union state, even though it's a border state and it had slavery, okay? What do we also notice, guys? We notice some of the more important things, which is the Confederacy is doing reasonably well, you could argue, in the Eastern and Southern campaign prior to 1863. 1863 is considered to be a turning point year for reasons that we'll talk about later. Okay? And then also just give you a little bit of a review, guys. The geography of the Western campaign. Keep in mind, this is going to be a campaign, as you can see, that the North is actually making some, or the Union, pardon me, is actually making some pretty strong amounts of pushes with. Okay, so you'll notice a lot of Union victories, which were very important to controlling this riverway. And eventually we'll look at the Battle of Vicksburg here on the next couple of slides. Okay, but what happens? Well, first of all, is that you're going to see, guys, some attempts by the Union Army to gain some ground, and they don't work right away. All right, so you'll notice, like moving into the fall of 1863, all right, some really important battles. So the Peninsular Campaign, what did we say about that earlier last time? All right, we said that this Peninsular Campaign is basically trying to control the area that's close to where? Within Virginia. All right, and why is that the case? Third point of the Anaconda Plan: control the capital. Remember what we said: capture the flag. Okay, if you can force their capital to surrender, most likely you're going to actually have a surrender for most of the other states, if not all of them. Okay, although there is something to be said about the Confederacy being a firm league of friendship, as it was called prior to the Constitution, with our first government. But anyway, we'll come back to that in our next session when we talk about some of the shortcomings of the political side of it. Okay, Antietam, guys, remember, geography is big. The idea of Antietam, this is not, a hop, skip, and a jump from Washington, D.C., but as you can see here, it's also not that far. All right, So it's very important, guys, that you're trying to protect your capital city as well and not just going after the capital of the other group. Here's Richmond. Here's Washington. Probably that's about about an hour and a half drive, give or take, depending on traffic. Okay, back then, imagine how long that would take to actually march that distance. Okay, so just keep in mind, things are very different from the standpoint, guys, of communication, transportation. Although, remember what we said the last time about the railroad, things are improving. Okay, and so September of 1862. Now, this is considered to be, guys, by many historians as the turning point battle. Why would they say that? Think about what turning point means. Something is going to basically shift momentum in some ways as a result of this war. So think about it like this. What's the one thing, guys, that the Confederacy might be wanting? And I'm thinking of the idea of foreign recognition. What does that mean? They want foreign countries to basically acknowledge that the Confederacy is a legitimate government, right? That it's not just a state of rebellion, that they are literally their own government. They can govern themselves. They have the ability to have what's called self-rule, etc. Okay, now, with the Battle of Antietam, guys, kind of an interesting story. McClellan does not have a lot of really good days, or shall we say campaigns during the Civil War. This, however, is one of them. Okay, so the story is evidently Lee's battle plans were found somewhere by one of McClellan. Keep in mind, he's a Union general, guys, talking about McClellan. And he basically was like, hey, here's the plans. And so they kind of pretty much know what the plan is. And so this is one of the few Union victories that really stand out quite a bit, as you can see, okay, in this area right here. Okay, excuse me. Okay, and so you notice that. That's really important. And so what this does, think about what we just said. If you're trying to get foreign recognition, what countries are probably the first on your radar? France, Great Britain, Spain, in other words, European countries. Okay, you could make a really strong argument, guys, that this battle does not produce, okay, recognition. And that's a big deal because, guys, think back to the American Revolution. What does recognition do? Well, it brings in the French on the side of the United States. It brings in the Dutch. It brings in the Spanish. The Confederacy is not going to have the same degree of support. Okay, so it's something to definitely keep in mind. So it's a foreign policy victory, you could argue, just like it's a literal victory on American soil. Okay, so take a look at these other two battles. Now, these are probably, guys, especially Gettysburg, two of the more famous battles that happen into 1863 and beyond. Vicksburg, we'll look at a map on that in a little bit more detail, located right, literally, guys, off the bank of what river? The Mississippi. And think about the significance of that with the Anaconda Plan. If you can control the Mississippi, you can control a lot of the trade, you can control a lot of the different strategies that the Confederacy might have. You can break them into two parts. In other words, it gives you a huge advantage. What this is also going to do, guys, is it basically brings to the light of Lincoln. And I'll tell you a story about how this battle was won here on one of the future slides so you can see the geography, guys. But this is actually one of the really important victories because Lincoln finally has some light at the end of the tunnel, which is who becomes the famous hero of this battle and this campaign. It's going to be Grant. Grant is going to be the guy that eventually Lincoln says, all right, you are the lieutenant general of my Union Army, okay, which is a pretty important position, okay? Gettysburg happens, as you can see, about the same time. Keep in mind, this is actually the Eastern Theater. This is considered to be also a turning point battle. Now, kind of an interesting story, guys, with the geography of Gettysburg, as you can see. Why would the Confederacy go into Gettysburg? I think I told you all the story last time. A lot of it went back to supplies, okay? So the thought was, let's go there. There's going to be a really big battle here. This becomes a very casualty-heavy day, as was Antietam as well in the fall of 1862. But guys, what do we notice about Gettysburg? It's a Union victory. All right. As will be the famous Battle of Vicksburg. And so, guys, what we start to notice between 1863 and 1865 is that the victories for the Confederacy are becoming smaller in number and also smaller in significance, because the Union is basically going to be making a lot more headway. Okay. So just really quick, the Battle of Vicksburg, there's a better map on the next few slides. Guys, take a look at this. Like I said a moment ago, right off the bank of the river. But look at this, guys, a little bit more of a blown up map. You can easily see here the railroad. So this is a very important battle and a very important location from the standpoint of trade, etc. Not just because of the river that goes through there, but also because, as you can see, of the railroad. Now, there's a problem here, and it's kind of hard to see with the map, guys, but Vicksburg is on a bluff. And if you don't know what that means, the basic nuts and bolts, guys, of it is that a bluff is kind of like an area that's on a hill. Okay. And so if you're Grant, right, so you're kind of the guy that's kind of in charge of this, you're thinking to yourself, okay, if I'm sending all my men up this hill toward these people, it's kind of like in Star Wars, right, where Obi-Wan says to Anakin in the famous lightsaber duel, don't try it, I've got the high ground. And he does, and of course he gets demolished, right, or not completely, but you know the point if you've seen the movie. Well, guys, think about it like this. Grant understands the following principle. If you send your men up the hill, it's basically almost like a slaughter. And so he's like, okay, well, I don't want to lose men. I don't want to lose, resources as much. So we're just going to basically surround them. And so he uses what's called, and you can see it here, guys, a little bit, he uses what is called the siege technique. Okay? And so what does that mean? It means that you surround your enemy. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. Okay? And so basically what he does is he puts pressure on the fort or the area, guys, to actually eventually surrender, and the plan actually works. Okay? But as you can see, this was not just at the snap of a finger. Okay? You'll notice April 30th, he starts this out. Actually, as you can see, excuse me, guys, moved up there as early as December of 1862. He's very strategic. And eventually, guys, he starts the siege in May. And then as you can see here, guys, or actually, as I said before, by early July of 1863, what happens? Vicksburg, is actually eventually going to fall. Now, kind of a fun story, guys, is that Grant is eventually promoted. That's not the funny story. But guys, I found this in a book I read on Grant just a couple weeks or years ago. It was actually a biography on Grant. And guys, Lincoln said the following, because there was a big thing out there that Grant liked his, drinking and so forth. But look what Lincoln said, guys. I don't know if he was saying this in joking or seriously, but I think it's an interesting quote. He says, I can't spare this man. He fights. Find out what he's drinking and order it for my other generals. So clearly, guys, whether he's being serious, a little bit on the Lincoln humorous side, which was a very interesting sense of humor. But guys, at the end of the day, I think this also shows that he's been frustrated with the degree of leadership in his army for quite a while. And now he finally finds the guy that he can depend on. And so what happens in 1863? If you're in my class, we're going to read these documents together and discuss them. Okay. But guys, here's the thing that you find. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. I think most of you have heard of that. Now, the details we'll look at a little bit later. He actually draws this up about the time of the famous Battle of Antietam. All right. But it does not officially go into effect until January 1st of 1863. Now, something for us to keep in mind. This is not the formal abolition of slavery that we will associate with the 13th Amendment. But remember what we said earlier on in our earlier session, guys. Lincoln makes it very clear that this war is about Union first. Okay? I think, guys, what you notice is that with this, you notice that Lincoln is, I don't know if he would say he's completely changing the war's focus, but he's possibly, according to some historians, redefining the purpose. So the war is still very much about Union. Guys, we'll see what he has to say in his second inaugural, at least an excerpt of it here in a second. right? But he makes it very clear that, you know what, if you're a state that he considers to be in a state of rebellion, there's 11 states. Now, this does not apply to what states? The border states. It does not. It does not apply to states like Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. Although, as we know later on, all those states are going to be impacted by the 13th Amendment. That's going to be passed, in 1865. Okay. But what do we notice? We notice momentum is shifting. Okay. Lincoln obviously is seeing that. Western campaign is starting to yield some success. The Eastern campaign is starting to also yield some success. The momentum shifts to the Union. All right. So we're starting to see, guys, or the Union, is starting to see that there are some significant battles that are being won. Gettysburg is a big defeat for the Confederacy. A lot of deaths on both sides there. November of 1863. Okay, we're going to read this together, guys, if you're in my class. Lincoln basically issues the famous Gettysburg Address. Okay, and I'm going to show you on the next slide why that's important. One thing that's interesting, guys, imagine that you're living back then. Who is probably the most well-known of any African-American abolitionist at this point in time? And it's going to be who? Frederick Douglass. Douglass is a free man at this point in time. He has sons. He's advocating, guys, that Lincoln opens up the opportunity for African Americans to serve in the war. Lincoln is kind of, visited by Douglass on several occasions. From what historians tell, guys, there's an exchange there. Why would Lincoln be a little bit on the apprehensive side? Well, there's still a lot of, a division there. And guys, Douglass is like, let us serve, right? Let us have some degree of a role here. And there's a big thing that erupts, or maybe erupts is too strong of a word, that develops. And Lincoln is like, hey, yes, I get it. You want an amendment. You want this and that. But guess what? As president, I have all these different things that I have to manage. All right. If you fast forward the clock, guys, about 100 years, almost to the exact year, 1964 to be exact, you're seeing very similar kinds of exchanges between the civil rights leadership of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and presidents like John F. Kennedy and eventually Lyndon B. Johnson. Okay. But Lincoln does eventually say, we're going to allow for some African-American service. All right. Gettysburg Address, just really quick, 272 words. It's not long. And kind of a fun little thing, guys, is, and most of you probably have never heard of this guy before. You don't know about Edward Everett for good reason. I mean, we've all heard of Lincoln. He's kind of an afterthought name, and some people, unless you love studying history like I do. But guys, Edward Everett, believe it or not, was considered to be a really strong, shall we say, speaker in his day. He was a great orator. And he's the guy that preceded Lincoln. So imagine you're somebody there, you're waiting to hear from the president, or whoever it might be that you're really there to see. It's almost like if you've been to a concert, right? And you're there to see the main act, but you've got this opening act, and you're like, geez, just get the show over ready so we can actually see who we're really here to see. This guy speaks for about 2 solid hours. Lincoln gets up there, speaks for maybe a couple of minutes, and sits back down or whatever. And I think it's really impactful, guys, to look at what this gentleman had to say. I wish I could flatter myself that I had come as near to the central idea of the occasion in how many hours too as you did in 2 minutes. And as we're going to see, guys, as we'll study this together after the lesson's over, this address, guys, is so important. I mean, if you look at it, basically, guys, what he does in a nutshell, he summarizes the history of the country in about 272 words, the purpose to it, what happens if American principles do not continue to move forward in Lincoln's vision. It's important to keep in mind. Now, with that being said, where do we go from here following the early part of November of 1863? Well, the answer is, guys, the war is not over. Okay. Now, we know it eventually will be. April of 1865. Okay. But the problem is, if you think about it, or at least the situation, is Lincoln calls Grant back to the east. And he goes, okay, you're now going to be in charge of basically trying to defeat Robert E. Lee. But there hasn't been a lot of ground gained in places like Georgia, South Carolina, and also North Carolina. That's going to be where Grant has to go to another general. And so he kind of starts thinking, he's like, okay, what do I do here? And he basically says, okay, the guy that I think is going to be the best person to carry out my orders and do what he needs to do is, you guessed it, William Tecumseh Sherman. So Sherman is going to get a lot of very critical attention. I'll tell you a story about that in just a second. Okay. And guys, what he does is between 1863 and 1865, you'll notice here, guys, later September, you'll notice a lot of victories, like I said a moment ago, are now starting to go in the direction of the Union. Okay, so you see this one, we're going to call this basically the Southern campaign moving forward. All right, and the East will be still over here. But guys, what do we notice is that Grant leaves him in charge. Sherman studies things like census materials, documents. He finds out what are the most useful farms, where do a lot of people live, where could I actually, be able to destroy things that would not allow the Confederates to have things like food, etc. Right? In other words, it's very strategic, but it also is what you could call, guys, a very total war strategy. All right, I'll tell you more about that in a second. Okay, and so what William Tecumseh Sherman ended up doing is this famous March to the Sea. And it's not really that hard, guys, to think about, but he basically ravages Atlanta. As you can see there, it takes him a little bit less than a year to get through Atlanta from starting off. And then he goes all the way as far south, as you can see, as Savannah, around a little bit before Christmas. I read a story, guys, a few years ago that said that Sherman sends word back to Lincoln somehow. And evidently he kind of offered Savannah as almost like an early Christmas present or some kind of gift. Okay. So I don't know if that was really a good idea or not. But guys, take a look at what he does afterwards. He basically is like, okay, I'm going to continue into South Carolina. And guys, he treats South Carolina probably the harshest of any other state. Why? They were the first to leave the Union. And then, guys, as you see here, my home state where I hang my hat now is a great state of North Carolina. You'll see, guys, that this area is a little bit south of Durham. Okay. Now, I'll be honest with you. I grew up in Ohio, as I told you all before. We studied the Civil War. I grew up about right there, which is southern Ohio. It's about an hour north of Kentucky here. Okay. So I studied it. I knew a little bit about it, more or less about mostly Union victories, things or battles on Union, for Union victories. And I remember when about a year or two after I moved to North Carolina, I was in college and I was over at a friend's house, her grandmother's actually, and we were talking about something about mascots. Now there's a point behind the story, so stay tuned in. And I was the only non-person from the area. And so they kept going around the room. Well, we're the this and that, we're this and that. Well, it came to me. Again, I grew up in a place called Chillicothe, Ohio. The school I went to was Union Scioto. Guess what our mascot was? The Sherman tanks. Okay. And while we know that tanks developed later, not in this time period, okay, just the name Sherman, guys, as soon as I said that, you could have heard a pin drop. Okay. And I basically had, her grandmother, who was a nice lady, step in and she goes, well, Dustin, I know that you're new to our area, but just to let you know, we don't really mention that man's name in this house. He was a pretty destructive guy. And so I did a little bit of research, guys, and yeah, you take a look and a lot of that total warfare. Now, to be somewhat just to Sherman, you can make an argument, guys, that part of that strategy of total warfare was actually him following through from Grant's orders. All right, because guys, if you look here, you'll notice that Grant, once he actually is put in charge of the Union Army, okay, what do we notice? He has one objective in mind, and that is to defeat Robert E. Lee. Now keep in mind, and we'll talk about him next time a little bit more, I have not even mentioned to you the only president of the Confederate States of America, which was a gentleman by the name of Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. Okay. And so a lot of us guys are wondering, well, okay, we've talked about conquering the capital, which is where Davis would have been most likely. Why is he continuing to go after Lee? And the reason being, guys, is because Robert E. Lee was such a big name and such a big figure that the thought was, if you can stop Lee and make him surrender, that the Confederacy is going to be likely to do the same thing. Now, guys, you can see here, you don't have to memorize a lot of these battles, but Cold Harbor. Guys, this is how you could argue brutal total warfare got. Okay. One historian put it like this, that the Battle of Cold Harbor, you can see this is June 3rd of 1864, which, oh yeah, by the way, is a re-election year for Lincoln. We'll talk about that here in just a second. Okay. But Lincoln is like, okay, you got to basically do this. He's following through. But guys, this historian made the argument. He said that one of the reflections on Cold Harbor, get this, was that there was so much blood on that battlefield, all right, that you could have walked from one end of the battlefield to the other, back and forth, north, south, east, west, whatever, and you would have been up to your knees in blood of Union soldiers. That's a lot to think about, guys. But that is the kind of mentality that you're going to see that gets Grant, a degree of criticism as well. Okay. So something to keep in mind. So Lincoln is going to be up for re-election in the year 1864. Okay. Keep in mind, most of the Democrats were actually a part of the South. All right. So they're actually going to be an important piece of the puzzle within the South. Okay. One thing for us to definitely keep in the back of our minds, guys, is the idea of how there's going to be a lot of pressure on Lincoln. Lincoln is not altogether confident. The election, by the way, is going to be in November of 1864. But guys, look at what Lincoln says. He is not confident that he has this election in the bag. All right, we'll talk about his opponent here in a second. But look at what he says. He says, this morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that the administration, meaning his term, will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect. That's, by the way, the formal term for a president that's been elected that won't take office until March. Today, that would be January. They changed the inauguration date in 1933. As he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. Okay, so guys, think about like this. What is Lincoln really getting at? I might have to work with the next person between November of 1864 and March of 1865. So what is that? About 4 months approximately. Okay, to actually move this person forward. Okay. Now, a lot of you are wondering, okay, well, what happens with this election? Glad you asked. Lincoln wins. His opponent was George B. McClellan. McClellan was a Democrat. All right, Lincoln wins by a pretty strong margin over McClellan. McClellan, ask yourself the question, guys, what do you think McClellan's biggest argument would be? He's been fired by Lincoln. He's probably going to make arguments pretty substantially. Well, you couldn't win this war, blah, blah, blah. Let's just kind of end it, et cetera. Lincoln, guys, not committed to ending the war under those terms. His second inaugural became very well one of the best inaugurals of all time. His first one was pretty solid too. But guys, look at what he says here and really ask yourself the question, what is Lincoln really getting at? We're almost done with our session today. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. So he's reflecting on the reality of 4 years before. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, meaning his 4 years before, devoted altogether to what? Saving the Union without war. Again, guys, very Henry Clay-like. Union, union, union. In other words, unity in that respect. Insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. So essentially, what is he getting at there? All right, the war was not something that he really wanted, and maybe either side didn't want, but events unfolded, and here it is. Now, look at what he says next. I think this is really, guys, if you look at probably most of this address, I think this really stands out quite a bit. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Now, the question is, guys, what do you take from that quote? What is Lincoln really getting at? And the answer is, guys, I think reconciliation to an extent. Okay. He does not mention we're only going to worry about the Union wounds or deaths or orphans that are part of the Union or widows, right? Because remember, he does not see the Confederacy, guys, as a separate nation, right? His argument is that it's not constitutional for you to be outside the bounds of our Union. Ergo, you're still part of us. Okay. And so there's different interpretations here, but I think this is really important. Just something to keep in mind. This is less than a month before the former surrender. You don't have to worry necessarily, guys, about writing this date down. But as you can see here, the famous surrender at Appomattox Court House is huge. Okay. And guys, keep in mind, Lincoln, just a real quick ending to this, guys, before we move on to our next lesson next time. What happens? Lincoln is shot and killed April 14th of 1865. You can look up different theories. Was it a conspiracy? Was it John Wilkes Booth that really shot him? There's different theories out there. I personally feel like that's probably the more common one. That to me is probably accurate. But guys, at the end of the day, Lincoln essentially has 5 days. 5 days to put the nation back together. Okay. Before he starts. Okay. This plan to try to put the nation back together, which is what we call Reconstruction. That's going to be what we start early next quarter. Okay. Guys, appreciate your time. Next time, we're going to start to look a little bit more at the outcomes. All right. We'll start to maybe look a little bit even into Reconstruction. What are some of the things that need to happen? But as always, guys, appreciate your time. Hope you all had a great session. And as always, guys, feel free to let me know if you have any questions.